Mm.
There's Sharon. Sharon's on.
Why is that doing that? How do you see him? Oh, he's on mode.
Well, there's text.
Is that because we're too close to you? I don't know why I can't get into my computer, honey. Somebody has to show me. You have your phone on vibrate?
Yes.
Why is mine echoing?
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be joined by a few more, so I'll wait a couple of minutes. I'll invite those of you who currently have your cameras switched off, if you can give us a video view of you, then it makes it feel even more like a class so that we can see each other. I have currently muted everybody. It's the wonderful power given to the host of the group. And tonight, for the most part, it's going to be me doing the talking. This is more of a lecture this evening than a discussion, but there will be an opportunity for questions later on, and I'll invite you to come off mute at that time. But let's just wait for another minute or two as more people join us.
Danny, you look so official.
We aim to please.
How you doing?
Great, thank you.
Good to see you. Thank you for doing this.
It's,
We are having our family virtual Seder between Dallas, New York, Boca Raton, New Jersey, Atlanta. So it's gonna be great.
It sounds like a technical, complex venture, but I'm sure it will be.
I'm hoping that you're gonna help me make this happen. How about you? Are we doing a Jerusalem? No. Pittsburgh?
Pittsburgh, all Pittsburgh.
Okay. Okay, great.
Thanks.
Really
Elie.
like your glasses, Danny.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure we're going to be joined by others as time moves along, but I like to start promptly, and so let's make a start. Just to give you the parameters of the evening here, this session goes through 8:30. We are going to record. In fact, you can see that we are recording this session so that others will be able to take a look at it later, or just in case you have to tune out at some point, you can come back in and look at the recording at a later juncture. I'm going to be talking, so I'm going to put everybody on mute for now. And I'm going to invite you to hold off on asking questions. The way I'll set this up is I'll do a presentation till about 8:10, 8:15, and I'll ask you to write your questions into the chat section of Zoom. And at the conclusion of what I have to say, I'll ask Sharon Perlman my colleague from the foundation. And we're joined also by Jan Barkley and Dan Brandeis from the foundation. I'll ask Sharon, though, to read the questions for us, and I'll answer those at the conclusion of our time together. I want to start off with a shameless plug, if you'll forgive me. And the shameless plug goes like this. We are offering a great deal of adult learning at no charge. And this particular session is probably the crown jewel of them all. But you know, as I do, that there is a tremendous need that has already developed in our community, great vulnerabilities, and a lot of people who are hurting. And therefore, anything that you can do to contribute to the well-being of others, and particularly, obviously, if you want to do that through a gift or an increased gift to the Federation, it's just a really important thing to be involved in right now. And I don't have to tell you that as Jews, that's what we do. So I never usually start off that way, but I think it's very appropriate at this time that we have to set what we say and what we do into the context of the reality that we are all experiencing. And that reality is a tragic one. All around us is sorrow, death, illness, loss of work, loss of promise, loss of future. There isn't a person in this class who hasn't been touched already by some type of loss, your loss of freedom, at least temporarily, to go where you want and do what you want, financial loss, and there are people in the class tonight who I know have anxieties about loved ones who are at risk in these circumstances or who are already ill. And therefore we come together this Pesach at a very, very strange, bewildering, and disorienting time. And tonight what I want to present is how to put on a Seder, and perhaps more importantly, how our ancestors historically have responded to circumstances like this, and how they have dealt with these sort of issues in the past. And I want to make suggestions for how, in a very practical sense, you might think about approaching Seder in this unique time period in which we find ourselves. I'm not going to talk about technology. That's going to be something you'll have to figure out. I'm here to talk about something much more important, and that is, what do we do Jewishly? How do we respond Jewishly in this particular circumstance? And I know that many of you will be at Seders that are far smaller than anything you ever experienced in your life. And some of you will be leading Seder for the first time, or will be asked to say things or lead things in the context of a Seder in ways that you never have before. And I want to give you some pointers and some tips as to how to put the evening together. I'm going to start by making two general observations about Seder this year. And then I'm going to go into two additional sections of my presentation. So it's two general observations to begin with, and then Seder Theory and Seder Practice will follow. General observations, Seder Theory, Seder Practice. So first, two general observations. Question: how many people do you need for a Seder? Answer: you do not need a minyan for a Seder. Further answer: even though for purposes of reciting Birkat HaMazon, grace after meals, in its fullest sense, you would need three, you don't even need three for a Seder. A Seder can absolutely be done alone. And we know that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, after his wife died, he used to have Seder only with his wife, and after his wife died, conducted Seder by himself. Think about that for a moment. the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who most certainly would have been an honored guest at very large Sedarim, at very large Seders, had he chosen to attend them, preferred to have a Seder by himself. So the idea that a Seder can only be a Seder if it is done in the context of a very large collected group of people you love or care about is not true according to Jewish history. I want to also relate the story of Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin, who, when he was taken prisoner by the Soviets in 1940, spent the winter of 1940 and into the spring of 1941 in a Soviet jail. And when it came to the Pesach time of 1941, he was alone with just one other Jewish prisoner in a cell. And together they decided that they would hoard 4 cups of coffee because they surely weren't getting any wine. And with 4 cups of coffee and the 2 of them, they put on a Seder. Bacon recalls that he wasn't a particularly religious Jew. You don't have to be a particularly religious Jew to see Seder as being an important time of the year. And alone or in a pair, as Bacon did with his fellow prisoner in jail, or in any other small number, Jews perform Seder. I want to say something that is a little bit countercultural in this context. Family is not the essence of this night. This is not Jewish Thanksgiving. It is an experience in which we are united with the entirety of the Jewish people. So as nice as it is historically to get together with those we love and to have extended family all in the one place, as is the normative practice, that's not what the essence of Seder really is. So I would suggest to you that this is, in fact, an opportunity. There's an opportunity here afforded to us to do Seder and concentrate on Seder in terms of the small unit with which we will be spending that night being a component of a much larger whole, which is really what the night is fundamentally all about. We are going to have in the Jewish world this year, in all likelihood, more Seders taking place than ever before in Jewish history, because we are so partitioned off into smaller groupings than we ever have been. And in some ways, I want to suggest that that gives us even greater strength to communicate the message of what Seder is all about. You know, in the context of that particular observation, I also want to say something about being lonely as opposed to being alone. There are some people who are truly living alone and others who are living right now with just 1 or 2 other people. But the contrast between being alone and being lonely ought to be clear to us. Somebody who is alone doesn't necessarily have to be lonely. Lonely is a state of mind. Alone is a state of physical presence. And though we might not be in the physical presence of those with whom we want to share this particular holiday, we need not be lonely. These last several Shabbatot, I have got up on a Friday night and on a Shabbat morning and davened alone. I have chosen not to join in with any online davening because that's not how I observe Shabbat. I have prayed by myself. But in praying by myself, I never felt lonely. Why didn't I feel lonely? Because I knew and continue to know that all around Pittsburgh and all around Pennsylvania and the United States and the world, there were people davening exactly the same words that I was davening for Shabbat. More importantly, I was part of a historic community that connects me to every Jew who's ever recited those words throughout the history of our people and on into the future for centuries to come. I was alone in the room, but never lonely in Judaism. I am, as we all are, connected profoundly to every Jew through the very rituals and memories that we affirm on Shabbat and on Seder night, on every Jew in every historic locale around the world, and to every Jew who ever lived and who ever cherished these particular words. So don't think of yourself on Seder night as being isolated or fragmented or broken away. You are part of, connected to, a deeply embedded and cherished component of the Jewish whole. You are only separated by distance, not by emotion. So the first thing I want to say in terms of how many people do you need for a Seder? You just need one sentient Jew. And if you have more than that, that is a joy in and of itself. And that's my second point. I started off by talking about the sadness of this time and the heaviness of the hour and the difficulties with which we are living. And many of us are watching the news too often, through too many hours of the day. But this Seder night, April 8th at sunset, gives us the opportunity to change our mindset and change the mood. Turn off the noise, turn off the TV, shut down your sources of news, and determine that it will be a night of joy. Lamrot hakol, despite it all, we're going to approach Seder as a time of happiness and rejoicing. Why? How can I be so insensitive to talk in these terms? Because Seder represents the beginning of a holiday, 7 days or 8 days, depending on what your tradition is, that is described as, characterized as, Zman Cherutenu, the time of our freedom, the moment at which we became a people and as a people had the opportunity to exit Egypt and the hellhole of slavery that it represented. Remember, we had been in Egypt as slaves for 210 years. That's an awful long time. And for 210 years, just focus for a moment on what those 210 years were like. On Seder night, we don't spend any time on the horror of slavery. On Seder night, we don't spend any time focusing on just how awful that experience was. Oh, to be sure, we'll have some salt water and some maror, and we'll utter some words about bitterness. But we won't really take the time to dwell on just how horrendous 2.1 centuries of slavery really was. My friends, it was death. Decade after decade of horrendous death. Jewish life meant nothing. And the moment somebody fell down too weak or exhausted to carry on, they were kicked off the side of the pyramid in the most pitiless way, never given another thought. Jewish life meant nothing. If you think that we are going through a time of suffering, and we are, their suffering was deeper, more profound, more painful. And if you think that we are going through an experience that seems like it will have no end, there is much more possibility of light that we see ahead than they could ever have seen during those 210 years. We could have made Pesach into a time laden with depression, a time of mourning and remembering only the losses. A week of Kaddish wouldn't have been enough for the 210 years of losses. But that's not what Pesach is. And it's not what Pesach ever was. Please remember, in Auschwitz, Jews made Seder. If you can make Seder in Auschwitz, you can make Seder anywhere. Let's go a step further. If you're asked to change the mood in Auschwitz and live with hope and joy in that moment, then you can live with hope and joy in any circumstance, in any moment. So the challenge of the night is to carve out from the current experience a different emotional mindset and to say, not tonight will we be heavy burdened by our current reality. Tonight, we are celebrating something as old as the Jewish people itself. Tonight, we will greet this evening and this holiday with joy. Why? Because despite the fact that we lost so many through 210 years, Jews are determined not to focus on the death and the sorrow and the loss, but rather what that night of Seder will represent. That night of Seder will represent our liberation. We made Pesach deliberately into a holiday of rejoicing at freedom, a holiday of saying the collective of the Jewish people got out of there. Individual Jews might not have survived, didn't survive. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands were left behind, dead. But the Jewish people came out of there, determined to build a different world. And that's how we approach Seder, even in the time of sadness in which we find ourselves now. We as a people will survive this experience. Humanity will survive this experience. Yes, it is true, we will sustain terrible losses along the way. But we look forward to tomorrow with joy. Remember, after all, that part of the Seder, so often glossed over because it's in the second half, but part of the Seder is Hallel, Psalms of rejoicing. We give thanks and praise to God in songs of rejoicing that will repeat throughout Pesach, not just Zman Cherutenu, but a time of happiness. And the song you all know so well, Dayenu. What's at the heart of Dayenu besides the fantastic tune? At the heart of Dayenu is the idea that however much we have, we are grateful for the extraordinary gifts that we have been given. Grateful to have been brought out of Egypt, grateful to have been brought to Sinai, grateful to be given the gift of Shabbat, grateful to be part of this millennial people. So even in a time of darkness, even in a time of fear, anxiety, when we don't know exactly what the future will bring. Jews are determined on the night of Seder to greet the future, as we always have the past, with joy. Saying Dayenu, singing Dayenu, singing that what we have, even though it might not be everything we want, what we have will suffice. We will make our joy out of what we have. And that is a profound Jewish insight that is at the core of this night. And now I want to turn to Seder Theory, which sounds really fancy and complicated, but it's not. The number that is associated with Seder, as you know so well, is the number 4. 4 cups of wine, 4 questions, although, as you know, that is clearly the wrong title for Manishtana, because if you look at the Manishtana closely, the Manishtana has simply 1 question and 4 alternative responses to that question. So whoever came up with the phrase for the 4 questions really wasn't reading it in the original Hebrew. It's one particular question, that question that reverberates with us so deeply at Seder 2020. Why is this night different from all other nights? And then 4 alternative responses. So you have the 4 of the 4 cups, and you have the 4 of the 4 responses to Manishtana, and you have the 4 children. And of course, the question is raised, why all these 4s, to which the response is in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, we find that God brought us out of Egypt in 4 different ways. There are 4 different verbs used for how God did the job of bringing us up out of Egypt. And because of those 4, that's why 4 becomes so predominant at the Seder. And for that reason, I'm going to make 4 points in this section that I'm calling Seder Theory. 4 different headings for Seder Theory in order for you to remember the way in which our particular mode of doing Seder is structured. So the first thing I want to say about the mode of Seder in Seder Theory is Seder is all about memory. Memory. We are a people of history. I brought a prop here tonight. You all have one of these. Because we were all ready to do Seder in Jerusalem, I had to go to Amazon to get this special Seder plate. But you all have one, and if you don't have one, you don't even really need one. All you need is some sort of way of arranging the 6 items on the Seder plate. But think of those 6 items on the Seder plate, and think of how we're going to relate to them during the evening. They are all symbols of Jewish history. They're all part of our collective memory. We are our history. And I want to say in this context that there is no other people that I know of that has zecher, zachor, zikaron, memory, so deeply ingrained in who we are than the Jewish people. So Seder, as you know, is a symposium of memory. It's a symposium that tries to take us back to the roots of where we began. And let's remind ourselves that in the book of Genesis, we are simply a patriarchal and matriarchal clan. We are no more than 70 people. At the end of the book of Genesis, that's what it says. 70 people went down to Egypt after Joseph paved the way. And at the beginning of the book of Exodus, when that new Pharaoh arises, who didn't know Joseph, the clear statement of that new Pharaoh is that we multiplied and multiplied, became too numerous, and therefore we were a threat, and that Pharaoh would have to deal with us, with the threat that we represented. And so slavery begins. The odyssey of horror that we remember on Seder night. What are we remembering? What is this memory all about? This memory is all about who we are. Because just as you can tell a lot about an individual human being if you know their history, so too you can tell an awful lot about a people if you know where they came from. And this people, our people, whether you were born into it or joined it later in life, our people is a people that was formed in the crucible of slavery. We were a clan when we went down there, we multiplied, we were atomized as individual slaves, we had no connection to each other, and we only become a Jewish people with this experience of being able to get out of Egypt, Yetziat Mitzrayim. Small wonder that we recall it in our prayers, in our davening every single day. Small wonder that every Shabbat, when we take up the Kiddush cup, we talk Yetziat Mitzrayim. Pesach and Seder is the time when we focus on it most, but it never leaves our lips every single day, Yetziat Mitzrayim. Because that getting out of Egypt, that was the formative experience that created the Jewish people. From slavery to redemption. That particular historic memory is what makes us who we are. And here I want to say something very important about the nature of Seder and why you mustn't forget, when we get to the practical part of this, to do something after the meal. 78% of Jews never get to the second half of the meal. I just made up that statistic entirely. But the great majority of Jews never come back after the meal to do anything post in the second half of the Seder. And you know why that's a mistake? It's a mistake because the whole choreography of the Seder goes from slavery at the start to redemption at the end. It begins in darkness and ends in light. The first half of the Seder, the pre-meal part, is all about slavery and the experience of what we went through, the darkness of those terrible times. And then after the meal, some of you don't even have any memories of this part, after the meal is when the hope of redemption, the hope of a better tomorrow, the great Jewish message of from darkness to light gets fulfilled. So I'm going to make some suggestions in the practical part as to how to do this in a brief way. But what is really important is that somehow or other you acknowledge the second part. Because the second part is what fulfills this memory. The memory begins in the darkness of slavery, but we are coming to the experience of getting out of Egypt and the hope of a better future. So in terms of Seder theory, point one is we are a people of memory, and this is an experience of memory. We are remembering our history, and in remembering our history, we are remembering who we are and where we came from. Point two, it's a night of questioning. Questions. If you fail to have people around the table ask questions, it's not a Seder. If you got out the Hagaddah and you read the entire script from the beginning to the end, and you checked every box and did everything, but nobody ever asked a question, it's not a Seder. This is a night of questioning. This is a night when we are asked to engage our brains, to demonstrate that we are intelligent Jews who understand the message. And no good student ever understood the message without clarifying it by asking questions. The Manish Tana is only there in order to be a sample question, as if to say, well, you could ask this, but you don't necessarily have to ask this. Ask something better. It's there in order to prompt questions. Some of you will have young people with you, kids. Many of the things that we do in terms of the rituals that we go through at the Seder, the things we eat, are there in order to prompt them to ask good questions. If they're not, model it for them. Make sure that it's a night of questioning. Remember that this too is a critical feature of who we are and where we came from. Who's the first Jew? Abraham. What's the formative experience that Abraham goes through? The very first trial that God submits Abraham to? Sodom and Gomorrah. God has every intention of destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham has other ideas. Will not the judge of the whole earth do justly? The first Jew questions God. How can this be justice? How can this be reasonable? We are not supposed to be people who come to the night of Seder and simply imbibe a text mindlessly, mumbling words, thinking that the greatest creativity of the evening is if we go around the table and everybody reads a paragraph in turn. That's not what it's about. None of you want to disengage your intellect. Why would you do so at Seder? Ask pertinent questions that are relevant to the theme of the night. That will require some preparation. That's what we're here to do. I'm going to give you some sample questions that you might ask when we get to the practical part of this. But when you ask them and how you ask them and which ones you want to ask is going to require you to do a bit more prep even after this. But remember, questioning is what should be invited throughout the night experience. Memory number one, questions number two. Number three, telling. Telling. The book is called Hagaddah. It's from Lehagid, to tell, to relate. We have a particular experience. We have a narrative. We want to tell that narrative. Oh, I know. You know it so well. You heard it for so many years. Why tell it all over again? To which the answer, of course, is part A, that there are those at the table who've never heard it before because they're too young or because they had never been invited to one of these experiences and they have to hear the narrative. But part B, every time you hear that narrative, you will find something different in it. You will find something that you hadn't focused on before. There will be an opportunity for learning. We are very preoccupied in our generation with Jewish continuity, as we call it. But what is Jewish continuity, if not telling the narrative of who we are from one generation to the next? And I know that now some of you are thinking, I won't have the next generation at my Seder. I won't be with them. It's just me and my spouse, or me and my significant other, or just me. What happens to questioning? What happens to narration if it's just you? To which the answer is, when the Lubavitcher Rebbe had Seder by himself, he asked himself questions and then he answered them. It's harder to have Seder by yourself because you have to look up the answers to your questions before you ask them. There's nobody else to give a response. But you know, in a sense, that's really the task of all of us. We all better be ready for whatever questions come along. It's not just the person who's leading. That person isn't even guaranteed to be the most knowledgeable in the room. We need to be ready for questions, and we need to be ready even by ourselves to remind ourselves of the narrative of our people. Memory, questions, telling. And point number 4, identity. Memory, questions, telling, identity. How do you understand what it means to be a Jew if you don't know the experience that we go through on Seder night? Why do we behave as Jews the way we do? Because my ancestors, our ancestors, were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And because we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, we know viscerally what it felt like. We were there. We went through that experience. B'chol dor vador, in every generation, every single Jew is commanded on Seder night to feel like as if you had been there. It's not supposed to be just an exercise of mind. It's an exercise of experientially trying to put yourself in that place. And once you've put yourself in that place, once you've been there, once you've walked in the shoes of those who were in chains, ask yourself what it requires of you. You know, one of the great theological struggles of Judaism, since we're talking theory, is why didn't God step in earlier? It's a great question to ask on Seder night. Really? 210 years? And we couldn't get ourselves out of there by ourselves? And God knew it? And God waited 210 years before God decided to step in to Jewish history and get us out of there? Why so long? It's a very tough denunciation in some ways of God standing by. Small wonder that later Jews would put God on trial. Where were you when we were suffering? But perhaps part of the answer, as terrible as it is that, in fact, we needed to go through the depths of that particular experience in order to learn and understand what slavery really meant. Without going through it, without having that as part of what formed us, we wouldn't know how horrendous it feels to be deprived of everything that we were deprived of. To be a Jew is to achieve something profound in the world when it comes to freedom. We will only do that if we are reminded time and again of what that freedom meant to us and how profoundly significant it was to get there after 210 years of incapacity. Seder Theory. You have to remember 4 things. You have to remember that this is a night of memory, when we're supposed to recall the signposts of our history and the symbols that go along on that night. It's a night of questioning, it's a night of telling, and it's a night of forming Jewish identity. Really trying to figure out, at its core, what does it mean to be a Jew and what is the job of the Jew in the world? And now I want to turn to Seder Practice, which will take up the rest of my time before I turn it over to you for questions. And I'm going to share a screen with you here. I'm hoping you can all see the screen. And just rearranging my screen here so I can see your faces. All right, on your screen, you can, on my screen, you can see the 15 steps of the Seder. And let me say, first of all, a few words about the term Seder itself. Everybody in this class knows that the term Seder means order. This year, I would suggest to you that you want to dwell on that word for a moment or two at the start of your evening. We are living in a time where everything seems out of order, where everything seems disordered, where our lives have been turned topsy-turvy. Nothing is in the order it should be. And so Seder comes along in some ways to bring us a sense of control, that even in times of great disorder and disarray, there is still a component of our lives that represents Seder, not just this night, but every day. We can make Seder, we can make order where there is none. Part of the job of the Jew in the world is exactly that, to bring about order in a disorderly cosmos, to try to create reason and sense and some perspective on how there could be orderly human life in the midst of the chaos in which we currently find ourselves, in which other generations have found themselves as well. So Seder, in its very essence of being a set order, is comforting in and of itself and its familiarity. And Seder always has 15 steps. And if 15 steps seems like a very big assignment, first of all, whatever Hagaddah you use will have these 15 steps. They're usually identified right at the start of the Hagaddah, just in the same way as you see them on the screen there. And most Haggadot will take you in order through these 15 steps. And most of these 15 steps are really brief. There are just a couple of them that take an awful long time. And so I want to talk practically about how we go through these 15 steps. But first, you're going to be approaching Seder night. On Seder night, even though you might not be where you want to be, and you might not be with whom you want to be, I want to make the following suggestion. Get dressed up. Put away the pajamas or whatever you might be wearing the rest of the week and go to your closet or your suitcase if you're not at home and get dressed up. I don't care if you're by yourself. I don't care if you're with your spouse. Get dressed up. Wear your nicest clothes. I put on a jacket to teach this class tonight, and I do so because I have great respect for the material that I'm teaching. When we actually get to do it, get dressed up. Why do I make such a big deal of this? Because how you dress impacts your mood. If you come to Seder in the same clothes as you wore or wear the rest of the week, it'll be a pretty relaxed, casual experience. And I'm not saying it has to be formal or stiff. I am saying it has to be important. What we are doing this night, on Seder night, is important. And one of the ways that we show that something is important is how we dress for it. So this, of course, is all advice you can disregard, but my profound message to you would be to get dressed up. And the other practical hint before we even get into the 15 steps here that is very important is provide the people around the table, however many or few you might be. And if you're connecting up with other people around other tables, tell them to do the same. Provide them with something to eat before you get to the symbolic foods on the Seder plate. Say an appropriate blessing. Don't make it matzah, because matzah has to be later on. Don't make it any of the symbolic things you're going to eat later on. Make obviously kosher or Pesach stuff, but make sure that somehow or other they have nosh to eat. A hypoglycemic Seder is a misery designed to have people stab each other with their forks before you get to page 7. It is critically important that people have something that will sustain them through the experience, or else they're going to tell you, you have 5 minutes and then we're doing dinner. If you want to have any hope of doing anything significant, this is probably the most important thing I'll say all night. If you want to have any hope of doing anything significant, at least come to this agreement with them. They will be fed so long as they're prepared to concentrate for a little while on a conversation and a ritual. Doesn't matter if they're full by the time it gets to be soup. I don't care. Make sure that they have food so the experience itself will be one that's possible, because otherwise everybody will just be extraordinarily grouchy and not in the mood for a positive Seder experience. So get dressed up. Ask your kids to get dressed up, even though they'll moan. They will remember it better if they get dressed up, and provide some nosh. Now, let's just go through briefly these 15 things, because most of them are pretty brief, and you can, my claim is you can do all 15 steps, even in the context of a relatively abbreviated Seder. Some traditional Jews, of course, spend many hours on this, looking at commentary and all sorts of texts. Most non-Orthodox families are not going to have anything like that time. But let's talk about what you can do, even if your family is going to require, or the people you're with are going to require, a relatively short experience. So step number 1, kadesh, k-d-sh, that which is separated and elevated. We're going to have 4 cups of wine. We just mention it as a step here in number 1, but it's going to pop up at other junctures in the Seder. And as you know, these 4 cups of wine, this is pretty simple, very brief. You take up the cup of wine, there's a special blessing for the festival, and then Brei Pri Hagafa, and then these
Danny, excuse me, but your list is not on the screen.
What is on the screen?
For right now, we are not free to go where we want when we want. Number 2 is who is enchanted.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's get rid of this one. I'm glad you said that. How's that? Still not. Let's get rid of this one.
Same.
Hang on. Technical difficulties, just 1 second. Almost there. How's that?
Perfect.
I apologize. All right, so now you can see, and we'll get back to those other 4 questions in a moment. Now you can see the 15 steps of the Seder. Step number 1, and you can see the word Seder at the top that I was referring to earlier on. See, this is a good example. The rest of you are also polite, but you got to be ready to ask questions. So that's the theme of the night, after all. Step number 1, Kadesh, the whole idea of these 4 cups of wine, and representing, of course, the 4 different ways in which God brings us out of Egypt. That's really quick. Step number 2, Orchas. The leader is going to go and wash ritually. I think most of you who have seen ritual washing at some point in your Jewish life, this is a 2-second job. We wash ritually here without blessing. And if you ask, why do we do it without blessing? It's because we're going to do it again in step number 6 with blessing. We wash ritually prior to a meal with blessing, and that's going to be step number 6. But here in step number 2, we're not prior to a meal, we're prior to a ritual. In order to differentiate between the washing prior to ritual and the washing prior to meal, we wash without blessing. at step 2, and with blessing at step 6. Step number 3, and here we're just burning through quick stuff. We're going to take the greens, right, whatever you happen to have. Parsley, most people use. We're going to dip it in the salt water. This is, as you know, reminiscent of the tears of our ancestors in Egypt, and we're going to consume some of that. And by the way, this is all designed for people to ask questions, right? Because this is unusual. We don't usually have a dipping routine. And so the whole idea is that some kid should say, why are we doing this? And if you don't have a kid at the Seder, well, you can just go through this material. But the idea is that they should ask, and you should explain. It's springtime, and in springtime, the calendar renews itself. And as the calendar renews itself, we remember the month in which we got out of Egypt, the month of Nisan. And so we dip and consume the springtime together with the tears. Number 4, Yacht. Again, very simple. You have 3 matzahs on the table, right? And if somebody asks you, why are there 3 matzahs on the table, you'll be ready with the correct answer. The incorrect answer that people often give is it's to represent the 3 different parts of the Jewish people, Cohen, Levite, and Israelite. It's a nice idea. It has nothing to do with reality. The reality, of course, is that on Shabbat, we have how many chalot? 2 chalot on Shabbat. Why do we have 2 chalot on Shabbat? Because we were instructed in the Torah to collect a double portion of manna in the desert on the 6th day of the week in preparation for Shabbat. And in memory of that double portion of manna, we have 2 chalot on Shabbat. But we're going to break a matzah before we get to the hamotzi here. And so we know for hamotzi, for Shabbat, and even for festivals, we're going to have 2 pieces. So if we're going to break one, we have to start with 3, practically, in order to be able to break one and still have 2 whole pieces left. So step number 4 here in the Seder, in the order, is Yachatz. We hold up these 3 matzot, we take out the middle one, and we break it. And of course, as you know, one portion of that breakage is going to go to be our afikomen, and the other portion we're going to talk about how let all who are hungry come and eat, right? We are going to remember that this is a time when we focus on the reality that we were slaves and didn't have anything to eat, and that the intolerable nature of that experience is going to remind us that we too want to involve people in being able to eat at this juncture. So Yachatz reminds us of the brokenness of so much of human life and of the desire to involve those who don't have enough to eat in our experience, which is why, classically speaking, though not this year, having guests at Seder and having guests who don't have enough for themselves at Seder is a thing that Jews have always historically done. Number 5, this is the really long part of the Seder. Number 5, Magid. This is where I talked about in the theory section, the whole idea of questions and narrative. Magid is the telling of the Exodus story and has questions and narrative as part of it. And you know this section for its highlights. As part of Magid, right at the start of Magid, you have Manishtana. As part of Magid, you have the 4 sons or the 4 children. As part of Magid, you have the recitation of the 10 plagues. As part of Magid, you have Dayenu. As part of Magid, you're going to lift up your Seder plate and you're going to point to the shank bone and to the matzah and to the maror and identify what they all are. That's all part of this section called Magid. And for those of you who want to abbreviate your Seder, if you want to make it a shorter experience, select from the Hagaddah section called Magid, right? Take parts of it. Don't do the whole thing if time is of the essence. Now, for those of you who want to have some sort of conversation or discussion at your Seder, and to my mind, as I've indicated, that's critical to the Seder experience, what you should bring to the Magid section is some questions for the night. And I've designed some, and let's pull this one away from Robert and get the other one out. Here, we see that one now? Yep, great. I've designed some, let's get rid of this. Some questions that you might care to use this year if you don't want to create your own. These are questions that I'll be sharing some of around my Seder table. You don't have to take them down because I'll email them to you after this class. But let's just go through them. Right now, we are not free to go where we want, when we want, because of the social distancing rules that are placed upon us. This is what we would refer to as restricted freedom of movement, right? We have some limitations right now put on our freedom of movement. What type of freedom, though, is the Seder talking about? The Seder isn't concerned with freedom of movement, it's concerned with a different type of freedom. So let's identify that there are different types of freedom with which we are concerned. There's freedom of movement, there's freedom from being enslaved, et cetera, list some of the other freedoms, right? Challenge those around your Seder table to list what types of freedoms there are. Let's identify. There are all sorts of different types of freedoms and rank them from the most important to the least important, right? Maybe we'll discover that the freedom of movement from that we are suffering from limitations with right now, maybe that's a less important freedom than other freedoms. Let's talk about what the different types of freedoms are and how important they are relative one to the other. That's one possible question. Number two, in our contemporary day and age, in 2020, who is enchained? Thinking about all the different types of people around the world. Who are the people who are enchained? Who is the least free? Who deserves our help the most, right? If part of the job of the Jew is to concentrate on where there is slavery to help bring redemption, where there are people who are enchained to help set them free, then who's in the worst case? Who should be our biggest emergency that we would want to address in 2020? Who are the enchained in this context? Number three, here in number three, I am quoting the second paragraph of the Amida that you encounter every single day at every single service, including Shabbat. The second paragraph of the Amida goes like this: with kindness do you sustain the living, and with great compassion do you revive the dead. You support the fallen, heal the sick, free the captives, and keep faith with those who sleep in the dust. And here's my question. If there are alternatives, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, bringing captives to freedom, which one would be your primary task and why, right? In other words, ask the people around your Seder table. Here are three really important jobs, right? Three jobs that are at the core of what the second paragraph of the Amida talks about, and surely at the core of this night: feeding the hungry, healing the sick, bringing captives to freedom. Which one should be the primary task if you can only do one, or how would you order them and why? And my fourth question, because everything comes in fours, we have been saying of late, we're all in this together, right? All of humanity is going through this same experience. But the Seder, of course, talks about Jewish suffering through the ages. If you get to the second part of the Seder, we get to a particular section. Are we likely to come out of the current crisis more together, or will we be thinking of this particular section of the Seder? In every generation they rise up against us to destroy us. Part of the Seder memory that we recall is how we suffered. And we didn't just suffer in Egypt. Don't have to tell you, we suffered in every generation, in every century. In every generation, b'chol dor v'dor, they rise up against us to destroy us. Is it likely that we will come out of this current time, this extraordinary moment through which we are living, with humanity sensing that we are all in this together, and therefore embracing Jews as at no other previous time in human history? Or will we come out of this experience and again say, B'chol dor v'dor, in every generation, they rise again up against us to destroy us? Is it more likely that we will come out of this experience feeling more at one with humanity, or still in some way separated from the rest of humanity. Go back and open the other window. Did the other one come up now?
No.
No. One moment. Are we good now?
Yes.
Yep, great, thank you. All right, so that's number 5, the Magid section. And then the other ones prior to the meal, number 11 is the meal, are all really quick, right? Rochza, everybody gets up and washes their hands ritually. Motzi, this is what you are classically used to on Shabbat, right? The blessing over bread, except this time it's a blessing over the 2 matzot that remain after you broke the middle matzah. Number 8, the special blessing, alachilat matzah, that we say for matzah itself. So number 7 and 8 are just really 2 quick one-liners. Number 9, maror, eating the bitter herbs together with charoset, as you know, the symbol of the bitterness of slavery, together with the mortar and brick recollection of the store cities and pyramids that we had to build for Pharaoh, that the charoset represents. Number 10, also very fast, the korech. We make a sandwich, as you remember, according to the instruction of Hallel, make a sandwich with matzah, with chazeret, the other bitter that we have on the Seder plate, and the charoset as well, and we eat the Hallel sandwich. And then we get number 11, right, which is what everybody's been waiting for anyway, and that's the other long part of the evening. Long parts of the evening, number 5, the Magid, and number 11, Shulchan Orech. And that's where most people leave off. But I want to say a little bit before I finish tonight about 12, 13, 14, and 15, and how you might do these with an abbreviated approach. So number 12, many people do, especially if you have kids around. Number 12 is Tzafun, the Afikoman, right? Why do we have an Afikoman? Here, very important for this year. We have an Afikoman because the Afikoman is supposed to represent not only the end of everything you eat, but the end of all entertainment for the evening. It used to be a long time ago, before the rabbis put the Seder together, that people would go through the narrative of the evening, then go off to other parties and other places of entertainment. Of course, in keeping with Pesach, but still to be with friends and do other things. The rabbis want the Seder to be the experience that you take to bed with you before you retire, and that you go into morning services with. So, and of course, it's late by now, right? However long you've run your Seder, the meal took a while, and so the night is coming to an end. The Afikoman, therefore, is supposed to be the end not only of what you eat, but it's going to signal that once you finish the second part of the Seder, you are also done with the entirety of the evening, and after that, you should retire. Why is that particularly important this year? Because the temptation, of course, will be after you've put everything away and tidied up a little, to find out what's going on in the world, to find out what exactly is the world up to in this particular context. And I would urge you, in order to make it chag, and I don't care how traditional or not traditional you are in this particular context this year, in order to make it chag, in order for it to feel like a festival, and for you not to get reabsorbed in all the very difficult sadness going on around us, in order to keep the mood of Seder going, don't do anything after Seder to turn back to the real world. Try and keep the atmosphere of the evening alive by making the end of Seder the end of your evening. So by all means, sit around and talk with each other, with whoever you happen to be sharing Seder with, but don't go back to the real world. That, I think, is the message of the Afikoman. And if you're wondering, if you're by yourself, how exactly do you hide an Afikoman and then find it? The answer is go hide it now. as soon as this session is over, because you'll have forgotten where you hid it by the time you go looking for it, right? You could do this even if you're not going to be by yourself. Hide the Afikoman way before Seder, so you too have forgotten where it is, and then it's really a great search for the Afikoman. 13, 14, 15. Barech, number 13, is of course the grace after meals. This is familiar to many of you from Shabbat. We have longer forms of Birkat Hamazon. We have shorter forms of Birkat Hamazon. Clearly, this is a festival Birkat Hamazon, grace after meals. And again, if you want to abbreviate, this goes on for a long time. So find some way of abbreviating if you want to abbreviate. But, and here's the really important but for this year. As part of number 13, you don't see it here on the list, but as part of number 13, Elijah appears, right? We get to the end of Birkat Hamazon, we come to the end of the grace after meals section, and then we are going to open the door for Elijah. And those people who have never gotten to the second part of the Seder or haven't gone beyond the Afikoman haven't done this. You haven't welcomed Elijah. But here I want to say something very important about Seder 2020. Since you can have no guests, Elijah is the only guest who will arrive. This year, Elijah is the only person coming. This year, you will only be able to open your door for Elijah. And when Elijah comes, even though no being will appear at your door, but when you open the door for Elijah, you are opening your door for that individual who brings the sense of hope that the Jewish future and indeed the human future can be profoundly different from what it is. And here I want to read to you just a few lines from Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel put together a Passover Hagaddah when he was alive. And I just want to read to you a few lines that Wiesel writes about this opening the door for Elijah and what that experience represents for our people. Elijah, Wiesel writes, is friend and companion to all who need friendship and comfort. He is the mysterious stranger who arrives at precisely the right moment to bring hope to those in despair. We have no better defender in heaven than Elijah. Not only is he forever concerned with Jewish suffering, but he also shares his concern with God. He is the chronicler, the historian of Jewish distress. He records every tragic event, every upheaval, every tear. Thanks to him, nothing is lost. His most glorious role is that of witness. He is the memory of the Jewish people. And this sentence, perhaps most of all. One day, Elijah will come to stay. And on that day, he will accompany the Messiah, with whose destiny he is always linked. You can't go to the end of Seder night without welcoming one guest. This year, the only guest. The guest who heralds a better future. The guest who witnesses every tear. The guest who acknowledges our anxiety, and the guest who is the hope and the promise for a better tomorrow. Remember, the experience goes from degradation to elevation. And Elijah is the first glimmer of just how high we see that elevation going. And then we're going to go one more step, because we go from number 13, Barech, to number 14, Hallel. And in Hallel, we will sing psalms of praise. And again, this is lengthy, so select at will. And clearly, for those people who don't have time, you can skip past that. But this is just a reminder that the mood of the evening, the mood is one of joy as we sing songs of praise to God for having been brought out of that terrible experience of slavery, and knowing that we will be brought out of every terrible experience with which we're confronted. And then finally, we come to Nirtza, conclusion. And again, if you skip past the grace after meals and you skip past Hallel. Don't skip past Elijah and don't skip past Nirtza. Nirtza is all of one paragraph. And that one paragraph concludes with Bashana Haba'a B'Yushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. Just as we do on Yom Kippur, so on Seder night, it ends with next year in Jerusalem. And here I also want to read to you from Jonathan Sacks. Jonathan Sacks, who relates the following about by the way, Jonathan Sacks' Hagaddah, this is the Hagaddah that he authored. His commentary is the following about this next year in Jerusalem conclusion to the Seder. It is said, writes Sacks, that Napoleon, passing a synagogue on Tisha B'Av, was struck by the sound of lament coming from the building. What, he asked one of his officers, are the Jews crying for? For Jerusalem, came the reply. How long ago did they lose Jerusalem? Napoleon asked. More than 1700 years ago. Napoleon was silent for a moment, and then he said, a people that can remember Jerusalem for so long will one day have it restored to them. And so it has come to pass in our time. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a dark night, but we have to remember the broader context. We also live at the time of a restored Jerusalem. We live in a miraculous period in Jewish history. We will come again out of the darkness and into the light. But we should always give thanks that our Seder, even in 2020, even though it might be much smaller in terms of the people we can actually be with than we might want, it still is part of an extraordinary period in Jewish history where the light overwhelmingly outweighs the darkness. The miracle of Jerusalem and the way that Seder night comes to a crescendo of hope shouldn't be lost on us, even in a time of death and anxiety and sorrow. If we are to be the Jews we are commanded to be, that has to be our theme, even now, even in the midst of what we are experiencing. And with that, I'm going to stop and I'll take down the screen share here so we can see each other. And if you have questions, I think you can come off mute if you want to articulate your question, or you can type it into the chat section if you prefer. Some questions have already been put there. Sharon, you want to take these over? You're on mute, Sharon.
I don't see any questions.
Are there? Okay, no questions. So no questions in the chat section. Are there questions that people have that are not currently in the chat section? You can certainly come off mute and speak your question out loud if you have a question.
Danny, it would be nice to have the entire recording and just let you run our Seder with it.
No, this was not a Seder. This is just prep for Seder, but I appreciate what you said. And I certainly will share with you both those sheets that we looked at tonight, so you'll get those by email after the session is over. Anything practical of that you're confused about in terms of how Seder gets put together, anything theoretical about the nature of how this should be presented, I'm open to taking any questions about Seder at all.
I have a practical question. My family, we're in 4 different cities and we use different Haggadah. So how do we figure out which one to use and all that?
It's a great question, Jan. Thank you. Look, I used to teach, when I used to teach Seder, I taught Seder by giving people 5 ways to have a miserable Seder experience. And obviously, if you wanted to avoid having a miserable Seder experience, you did the opposite. And one of my five instructions for how to have a miserable Seder experience was ensure that everybody around the table has a different Hagaddah. Because the moment that everybody around the table has a different Hagaddah, you will spend most of the night discussing where you're up to, what page you're on. This doesn't come now. This comes later. It will be a stage directions night. And by the way, one of the fears I have for those of you who plan to hook up various different locations by Zoom is that you will spend much of the night playing with technology and saying, I can't see so-and-so, and turn the camera this way and turn up the volume. And I understand why you might want to join together with people in that way, but if you allow the technology or the stage directions to become the center of your evening, it will not be a particularly uplifting Seder experience. So Jane, in direct answer to your question, clearly it would be better if people had the same Haggadot in front of them. And if you can get the majority of people seeing the same page, literally that would be a good thing. But if you can't, then have those 15 steps, because each Hagaddah has those 15 steps, and just ask people ahead of time. You might want to send people the 15 steps on email, and just ask people ahead of time to identify where they're going to be able to find those 15 different steps in the Hagaddah. So you can say, we're now turning to Urchatz, we're now turning to this particular section. Hopefully, therefore, you might be on the same page literally, but you'll at least be in the same section of the material.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, pleasure.
So as a practical question, if everybody, completes the first part of the Seder, and then are ready to have the Seder meal, how do you get back to having the second part of the Seder? Or should everybody at that point try to do their own second part, so to speak?
Look, I'm a great believer in classes and in Seder experiences, in warning people ahead of time exactly what the parameters of the evening are going to be, and then sticking to it. If you invite your guests for a particular time and they're all seated, you tell them, we are going to have Seder now for 40 minutes, and then we'll eat. And part of the eating is going to be appropriate discussion over the dinner, right? And we're supposed to also concentrate on some of these issues over dinner. But then we are going to come back for 20 minutes afterwards, right? And that's a given from the get-go. If you don't want to come back for 20 minutes afterwards, then you don't get dessert or whatever, right? But just set up the expectation so that everybody knows what the parameters are going to be, and tell them why. Tell them, look, I'm going to abbreviate the first part of the evening because this year I want you to get to the second part. And in the second part, there are some really important parts and some really uplifting parts. And no matter how long or short we make those two parts, it's very important that both parts be there. So as Jews, it wouldn't be a complete experience without the second part. So you're going to need to stick with me, and I'm going to be a little bit cracking the whip tonight, unusually, in the sense of asking you to finish the meal and then come back with me for this experience. And, if you know any of the songs that are part of the end of the night, right, even after the Jerusalem part, then Hagaddah and Echad Mi Yodea and all those songs kick in, hopefully people can experience a little happiness singing together as well. So my advice is just structure it in as if it's not an option.
Rabbi, there's a question from Barry and Dave Guzikowski. They want to know, do you have any experience creating your own Hagaddah?
No, I don't. I think it's a tremendously creative venture to go into if you have the bravery. And clearly there are all sorts of different materials that one could cut and paste. The online world is full of them. At the same time, I have to say to you that there is such an enormous range of Haggadot out there these days. in every language and for every Jew and for every Jew's interest. That if you can't find the Hagaddah that suits you exactly, by all means, be creative. But most people who don't want to go that far will certainly find something for them. And of course, you can't go shop for them right now. But I wasn't expecting to be having Seder here in Pittsburgh, and so I had no Haggadot. All my Haggadot, I had like 2 shelves of Haggadot in Jerusalem. So I ordered 3 different Haggadot on Amazon: the Elie Wiesel one, and the Jonathan Sacks one, and this one from Jonathan Safran Foer, the young American author of the New American Hagaddah. So I'm not following my own instructions. We're going to have 3 different Haggadahs around the table. I'm a bit in dread of that reality. Don't do what I'm doing here. Do what I say. But those I order all on Amazon, and they're all available. But by all means, I think it's a very creative endeavor if you want to take it on. Anything else, ladies and gentlemen?
Hi, Rabbi. It's Jeff Camp. Lauren and I have been watching and always, of course, thrilled with your thoughts and presentation. We had a question regarding the use of toys and puppets for the plagues, and that approach to engaging children around what from our perspective, if I'm not giving too much away, seems like it ought to be an emphasis on pain and empathy, as opposed to sort of celebrating the cartoony nature of the plagues, and wondering if you had a thought about that.
I do. I think that it is really important that we don't overly emphasize fun on Seder night, but that we emphasize seriousness. This is a serious experience. It's a serious experience that culminates in joy. And that's why I'm so much emphasizing the joy of the second half. But it's a serious experience because it represents and recalls a very serious part of our history that young people, that kids ought to be trained for. And I think, I'm not in any way trying to say that people shouldn't engage children. I think that's a really important part. One of the reasons why we have the whole modeling of the 4 children at the Seder is precisely in order to say to us, look, there are different types of people around your table, and you need to engage the old and the young, the people who are skeptical, the people who are not into it, the people who are into it, the people who don't know what to ask. You need to engage everybody. So you have to think very carefully about who the people that you're interacting with might be and what their needs are. But at the same time, everybody here pretty much knows who I am. I am not into making these experiences trivial recollections. So you have to be the judge. If you think that something that's brought to the Seder will illuminate and make a particular experience clearer and more profound, I'm all for it. If you think that it's ultimately going to make it trivial and something silly, then I would rethink it.
It's Margie Jebner here. And I was looking today, I got an email from PJ Library, and there's a very nice young child oriented Hagaddah that they put out that you can download on your computer if anyone's interested.
That's great. And I know that there are a number of really wonderful resources out there for kids. I just appeal to people, as I have said in the past, don't make it an entirely pediatric experience, because it's really important. If you want the Jewish people to prosper, it's really important that your kids and grandchildren see that Judaism is something that the adults in their lives take seriously, and that they have something to grow into, even if they run away from the table and do their own thing. In some ways, that's great, because what that's saying is, look, the adults are doing adult Judaism. One day I will be an adult and do adult Judaism. The moment that you make the whole thing oriented towards them. It essentially says to them, one day you will grow out of this and you too will give it up, right? That's the inverse of what we want. So by all means, there should be material that is directed towards every age group, and that includes the under 5s and the under 10s. But the whole Seder experience must not be that, because otherwise they will get the message that ultimately it will be something that they will put aside with the rest of their childhood, and that's the inverse of what we want to have happen.
Very good point. Thank you.
Al, go ahead.
Danny, I know you didn't want to talk about technology, but on Zoom, there's a voice delay. I do the Bethel services that way.
Mhm.
It's impossible to read in unison. It's impossible to sing in unison. What would you do in terms of like chanting Birkat or something when you can't all participate?
Look, you know, to my mind, I'll give you the tough answer. The tough answer is these are all good reasons not to use Zoom that night. And I know that answer is one which might separate people from the people that they want to be with. But what I presented tonight, I think can be done in any place, in any small group. If you're going to use Zoom nevertheless, I think that you're going to have to try to figure it out beforehand. You saw tonight with my fumbling with the pages that complexities arise with whatever you want to do. You want to try and practice it beforehand, but you're going to have to be patient with the technology not being perfect. It allows you to have some measure of togetherness, but my concern is that ultimately it might in some way or another detract from the power of the Seder experience, because you're so focused on the technology and on trying to make it work. Ladies and gentlemen, it remains only to wish you all a Chag Sameach, from our home to yours. And if you have additional questions or anything I can be helpful with, and let me again say, as I have in other classes, if there is anybody in your family who is experiencing personal difficulties that I could be helpful with as a rabbi, I'm most certainly available for that as well. Chag Sameach, please try to make it a Chag Sameach, a really happy evening and holiday as it should be, a joyous time, and stay healthy. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.